Today I'm going to be talking about public-private partnerships in Russia, and I should mention at the outset that this is sort of a labor of love. So it started as a paper, and now it's probably a book project, but it's joint work with Thomas Remington, formerly of Emory University and now a visiting professor at Harvard, as well as some colleagues at the Higher School of Economics. Various colleagues depending on the paper. So I want to start by just posing the puzzle to you. So when we talk about public-private partnerships, which I seem to have misspelled on this slide, what we really mean is actual cooperative relationships between Russian companies and individual schools, government schools, right? And what's sort of puzzling about it is that if you know something about work on investment, right, it's always kind of weird. Well, why do we invest in a setting where, you know, the government's functionally unaccountable and they're bureaucrats? And that problem becomes even weirder when you think about investment with the state itself, right? You provide them full information about your company, a lot about your products, and a lot about what you need in order to remain competitive, which gives them a lot of sort of ammunition if they decide they want to take over your firm. I'm not going to talk about that today, but actually myself and some colleagues at the Higher School have quite a bit of work showing that in fact this is one of the big risks that you face, particularly as a small and medium business person in Russia, is expropriation by the security services. So in Russia we have weak bureaucratic and political accountability. Now normally one of the ways you solve this problem and you create these cooperative relationships is by having a strong civil society, business associations and labor unions that can hold the state accountable. But those don't really exist in Russia, right, for historical reasons. And so the sort of puzzle is, given that these sorts of partnerships are generally found in places like Germany, Austria, sometimes in France, right, countries with much better institutions, why do we see this in Russia, right? It's just very, very puzzling. Now, the motivation for this project, substantively, is that Russia has a serious problem finding workers that are competent, what we call the skills gap. And so they need better trained people, particularly in the industrial sectors that aren't considered prestigious, right? So people don't go into them. There's also a lot of unemployment, particularly youth unemployment. And many of these people are people who aren't sort of suited for the traditional academic track. Either they don't want to go or they just, you know, want to be doing sort of other things. And then finally, this is important for developmental reasons, right? So if Russia wants to finally sort of get out of its status as a middle-income country, right, and join the ranks of the wealthy industrialized world, you want to think about ways to do that. And one of the best ways that other researchers have found is specifically to produce products that require more skilled inputs, right? So think of sort of what China's been trying to do, to go from just manufacturing the chips to designing the chips, for example, right? From manufacturing the cars to designing the cars, to putting in the software in the cars, these sorts of things. Theoretically, it's sort of a puzzle for academics because, again, these sorts of relationships are unheard of unless you have a strong civil society, a well-functioning market, or a sort of communist-style developmental state, none of which we really have in Russia, although we can talk about the developmental state part of it. And then finally, just empirically, this is interesting because most of the work on these things is in Europe, looking at the OECD, but generally using sort of historical materials and textual materials, very rarely actually with good data on what schools and firms are doing at the micro level. And so this project tries to contribute in all these areas. Now, the big argument I'm going to make, and the big argument we make in the paper, is that the state itself can actually take upon itself a lot of the functions that normally are performed by civil society. But then the question becomes, why do you trust the state to do that? And so what we're going to argue, or what I'm going to argue here, is that, one, the state has to prove that it has the administrative capacity, that it actually can go down at the micro level and make sure that schools and firms are keeping promises to each other. And secondly, you need some mechanism to make sure the state actually wants to do that. And here we're going to talk about the ability of business to access power structures, whether through formal institutions or through sort of informal channels. This allows the state to make promises that it will enforce these agreements, which in turn makes it more likely that both the firms and the schools are willing to engage in them in the first place. So just to give you some theoretical background, training is interesting because it's a form of investment, right? So all of the problems that you normally would see getting a company to invest in a new building or new equipment, you also see in getting them to invest in trained workers, right? The problem is there are a couple of unique issues around training. So one is that when a firm invests in a worker, unlike when they buy a piece of equipment, the worker can just leave, right? So another firm can come up, offer them a couple extra dollars an hour, hire them away, and then all of a sudden, all of the time and money you spent training that worker is gone. Similarly, for between a firm and a worker, if I'm a worker and I want to be trained in a particular skill, I need to know that my employer won't fire me the second the market turns south, right? I waste all this time and energy getting an education, and it can be rendered pointless if I don't have a job, right? Or if market conditions change. And then finally, the one that's most important for this talk is when you're training and you're working with the school directly, you as a company have to believe that the school is going to actually train competent people, right? That you won't have to spend a lot of time retraining them. And at the same time, if you're a school and you're working with a firm, you also have to believe that when the firm says, hey, look, train these people, we'll pay you, we'll buy you equipment, we'll hire your workers, they'll actually do that, right? Now, when you're trying to invest in training with the state, all these problems become even worse, right? So we know from work in the new institutional economics that the state has sort of final authority over its territory. And so in a circumstance where there's nothing you can do to constrain the state, right? No elections, no democracy, no threat of coups because the military is strong, the state basically does whatever it wants. And so where that creates a problem is that A, whenever you make an investment with the state, you are never quite sure that that investment won't be taken from you. But B, in sort of a very Russian problem, bureaucrats within the state, the bureaucrats that enforce the laws, that monitor the agreements, there's very little to make sure that they actually do their jobs, right? So normally the way it works is if I have a problem with people in, I don't know, the Social Security Administration, I take it out on my elected officials. The elected officials sort of pressure the bureaucrats, and things sort of work out, right? But if you imagine a situation where there's no direct accountability, right, what's to stop a bureaucrat from just demanding bribes or not doing their jobs, right? Now, public-private partnerships are particularly tricky because they make a lot of those problems worse, right? So the idea of these arrangements traditionally is the firm is going to provide some sort of benefit to the school, whether that's money for retraining, equipment, or guaranteeing that they'll hire students in exchange for competent workers. And the school is trading the time it's spending on these students, again, for this aid or for these jobs. Now, again, the issue here is it's sort of costly for both of them, right? Because the schools have to spend a lot of time figuring out exactly what the firms need, how to train workers to meet those needs, and then how to make sure all of this fits within the letter of the law, right? And at the same time, for firms, again, they have to make sure that when, you know, a worker graduates from a program, they're ready to go, right? Or at least reasonably ready to go. And so when you have these agreements between firms and schools, hey, we'll train your workers in exchange for something, right? How do you make sure that both sides stay honest, right? That's the fundamental question for this. Now, traditionally, one of the ways that you do this is through the state, right? So you create institutions. So this can be things like a ruling party. It's generally regarded as things like elections, right? Formal institutions that allow the state to monitor all sides in an agreement and to sanction them for non-compliance. right? And generally we think of this as sort of political accountability or political competition. Specifically for these sorts of public-private partnerships, the literature suggests that you can also get something similar when you have free and efficient markets where people can read prices and there's not undue government interference, or when you have strong civil society involved, when the firms are working together to make business associations, or you have strong labor unions, right? Again, with the idea that the civil society can pressure the state, and if you have a sort of free and fair market, you can just go to a court and they'll enforce your contracts. Now, the tricky thing in a country like Russia is that rule of law is questionable, right? So even when you go in front of a court, it's not always clear that the ruling will go according to the letter of the law, right? It could be corruption, it could be simple unprofessionalism in the judiciary. There are lots of reasons you can run into this problem. We also know that civil society, such as it is, doesn't really have a lot of opportunities to pressure the state directly, right? I mean, basically what you can do is try to mobilize, a couple tens of thousands of people in the streets, but that's not trivial to do, and certainly is not the sort of thing you can do when there's a violation of an agreement between a firm and a school. And so the question is, how do you get both sides to believe in each other's promises? So the argument that Tom Remington and I have made in this project is that the state itself can do it, right? If it can credibly commit to promises. And the reason the state can do it, particularly in a country like Russia, is that it has sort of direct oversight of the schools and also a lot of informal connections to businesses. So it can serve to get firms and schools together in the first place to negotiate these agreements. It also has the ability to monitor the performance once contracts are written and also to enforce agreements, right? Whether that's by pressuring the firms directly or by firing school officials and finding school officials that will keep their agreements. But the tricky part, again, that I keep coming to is why would you ever trust the state, particularly in Russia, right? And so we argue that the key for the state to be able to make these credible promises is its ability and its incentives. So here, what we mean by the ability is the actual capacity to go in and monitor local bureaucrats and firms, right? Some regions in Russia, so you can think of some place like Moscow, are really, really good at this. Other regions less so, right? And so first the state has to be able to show that it can actually do this. In terms of incentives, we make two arguments. So one is that actually if the federal government itself is interested in forging these partnerships, say they're looking to the large amount of youth who are willing to turn out and protest, they want to get those people gainfully employed so they get off the streets, right? Or say you want to build up military capacity, you need somebody to build those hypersonic missiles, right? That's not a trivial task. Those workers need to be highly competent. Or you just simply want to grow the economy, right? Then the federal government can actually pressure the regions, right? And it provides incentives for them to comply. The other argument we make is that you can find this through both formal institutions and informal institutions. So generally, right, we think about electoral accountability, and there is a lot of variation in Russia, even today, in the extent to which elections actually matter in the regions. So we test that mechanism. Although, spoiler alert, doesn't actually matter that much for this particular setting. But the other thing that we look at is sort of informal institutions. So here we're thinking specifically about the extent to which businesses can access the state, right? The extent to which people have political connections that they can leverage to let sort of higher level officials in the regions know, hey, this is a problem for us, we want to solve it, we need you to interfere, right? Or actually, the ability to use formal institutions in the regions, right? So specifically, actually building off David Zucconi, who I hope is well known to all of you here's work, right? The ability to use formal seats in the legislature or informal connections to the legislature in order to pressure the government. And so our argument here is that in Russia, these factors, either working individually or together, can provide the credible commitment, can make it so that firms and schools trust each other, which both increases supply on the side of the school and demand on the part of the firms, and this can lead to really costly, deep forms of public-private partnerships. So going beyond the sort of like, oh, we're partners, we're going to throw together, a sports fair every year, and to the firms are working with the schools to develop curricula, they're investing money in the firms, they're hiring the graduates. Now, if we talk about the federal government, and this is just to give you guys, check how I'm doing on time, this is just to give you a little bit of background. So in Russia, there was vocational education that encouraged these sorts of partnerships in the Soviet period. I'm not going to say a lot about it now, but if people want to discuss it and ask questions, the short version is in the sort of fires of the transition to the market economy, a lot of those give away, right? Whether the companies go under, the schools go under, or under new management, the firms just decide this is not for us. But we see sort of increasing federal interest in this, starting in, if I remember correctly, 2007, from a then intrepid Deputy Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev. That gets picked up on later when he becomes president, and eventually gets picked up on by Putin himself. And the reason the federal government cares about this is fourfold. So one, particularly prior to sanctions, they're looking at increasing the competitiveness of Russian industry, right? And so if it's the case that Russian industry is held back by the lack of qualified workers, one way of making Russian industry more competitive is to supply those workers, right? And workers with sort of world-class skills. Secondly, they're interested in foreign direct investment, particularly for German firms like Volkswagen. They're used to these sorts of close partnerships, and they're used to the ability to just show up, work with the school, and receive the workers they need. Generally, if you have any sort of foreign manufacturer, one of the first things they're going to be concerned about is, okay, we're going to invest time and money into this country, but are we going to actually find workers? And so this can help solve the problem and attract more FDI. Third, and near and dear to President Putin's heart, military procurement, right? Those tanks won't produce themselves, missiles are increasingly complicated, and so you need workers to actually produce these things. And then finally, as I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, right, there's this gap between what Russian employers want in terms of skilled workers and what's actually being produced. And for Medvedev, this is like a particularly irritating thing, right? So he thinks that vocational education schools, which is where a lot of this is happening, are viewed as places to sort of dump troubled youth, right? Youth that don't do well in a traditional academic setting, and you just need to stick them somewhere and hopefully they get something out of it. And for him, like, that's still a socially useful function, but what would be even better is if you had both those types of students and just generally talented young Russians interested in industry who could get trained, come out, and get a job immediately, right? And so he's very interested in addressing that gap. Now, the usual solution to these problems in Russia is you get like a prikaz from the top down, the federal government says we're going to do this, it's done. The problem is that, mostly for fiscal reasons in 2012, the federal government devolved authority over education to the regions. So to the extent that the federal government is actually going to follow sort of its own laws, they technically don't have as much authority to just force schools to do these things. So what they decide to do instead, and this is, I wouldn't say unique in Russia, but I'm not aware of literally any other program where this was done, right? They decide that instead of sort of dictating everything from Moscow, they're just going to let the regions figure it out themselves. And so what they do is they create a series of competitions under the Agency for Strategic Initiatives, which is an agency that is tasked with promoting economic development and monitoring the business environment. And these competitions are not just about money. In fact, actually very little money is involved. What it's really about is providing sort of organizational aid and administrative support to the regions to help them make sure that whatever they come up with complies with federal law. And the regions that tended to win in these competitions to promote like new educational reforms were those that specifically wanted to get firms and schools working together and had shown some success in this. What they ultimately do is they endorse sort of public-private partnerships that look a lot like what you would see in Germany, but adapted to Russian characteristics, right? So there's something old in this. They take from the Soviet era the practice of linking firms to one or more very specific schools, where the firm is providing patronage in the form of equipment donations and renovations to the schools to sort of solve their fiscal problems, and also providing nastavnichestvo, which is basically a mentoring system in which you have students go to the actual firm, work there with a specially trained employee, and actually learn on the job, right? And some adaptation of the German practice, right? Something borrowed. So here specifically, the German system tends to give stipends and wages to students as sort of apprenticeship and to guarantee them jobs after they graduate. And the firms are very closely involved in setting standards for these training programs and in actually administering the qualification exams. Because that way they know what they're getting, right? Not just in terms of what the school should be doing, but actually they can evaluate individual students. And here, there's sort of these coordinating organs that play a critical role. Now in Germany, this is basically business associations and tripartite commissions. And I'll talk a little bit in a second about what this is in Russia, but it's basically a sort of unified formal body where the firms and the schools can get together to solve problems and make plans with government officials. Now, there are a couple of novel elements here too, right? So usually what we find in our research is that these things are organized by regional governments, right? And typically, they create coordinating organs that are made up of businesses and ministries under the formal auspices of a regional governor. Now, the governor doesn't always show up to meetings, but technically the governor is always in charge of, not always, usually in charge of these things, right? With local issues being handled by sectoral associations. So they're sort of like business associations, but they don't have the quite broad powers and the mandatory membership that you see in Germany, right? Many of these actually get formed as a response to these. Although, in rare instances, with PIRM being basically the only one that we're aware of, you sometimes do get sort of literally the German model where a business association is doing this. And what's also interesting here is that all of this is tied to formal contracts. So we don't actually have these for even most regions or most years, but we actually have a little sample of these, and you look at them and they're literally formal legal requirements where the firm will do A, B, C, D, and invest E, and the school will produce this many workers who will then be hired by the firm, right? So these are legal documents. And generally what you see here is that the contracts are between the firm and the school, and the firm tends to take these obligations on in exchange for access to students. So not necessarily guaranteed hires, but the ability to go through all of the students in the school and say, we want these people to be part of the program for our factory, right? And what we argue is that this is actually a public-private partnership in the strictest sense, right? Because you have these government-run schools working together with generally private firms, although actually state-owned firms and partially state-owned firms also tend to use this form as well. Now, absent sort of German-style institutions, right, like how does this actually work, right? Again, the regional governments are taking on the roles usually performed by business associations in terms of monitoring firms and schools, making sure everybody complies, and making sure everybody's on the same page and coordinated. And we argue that this, along with the contracts, actually enables commitments between the firms and the school, right? And the federal government sort of oversees the whole thing. Now, what's important here is that there's a lot of variation across regions. Check again how we're doing on time. Well, we're almost out of time, so let me go through this quickly. So our project is sort of, actually I'm probably going to take like an extra maybe 5 minutes if you don't mind. Where our project is unique, particularly compared to studies of Germany and France and sort of other countries, or Switzerland where you see similar systems, is we actually have a lot of data at the micro level on who's doing what. So in Russia, particularly for the secondary vocational education facilities that tend to be most involved with this, they're required to issue mandatory end-of-year reports. So the data I'm going to talk to you today about is from 2013. We actually have everything from 2013 to last year, although we're still coding it. It's very labor intensive. But the data I'm going to show you today is about 1,600 schools across all of Russia's regions with 33,000 some odd partnerships, of which about 30,000 are unique, right? So this is actually, in the grand scheme of Russian industries, small, but still quite substantial. In terms of the firms involved, right? In terms of the schools, this is literally every secondary vocational education facility in the country. Now, what we do is we take these reports, their format varies, but generally the schools are heavily encouraged to report all of their social partners and how they're working with them. And part of the social partnership is these sorts of public-private partnerships. And so we code them for which firms are partnered with the school and what specifically the schools are doing. And we separate these into sort of two big buckets. The first bucket is what we call costly public-private partnerships. So these are things that require actual time and effort on the part of the firm, and substantial time and effort, right? So here we're thinking of things like guaranteed jobs, wages for students while they're training, student stipends, capital donations and equipment donations and capital investment, but also time-intensive things, right? So setting standards for the schools, writing qualification exams, working on the curricula together. Things that require the firms to not only know what they want, which many Russian firms have not thought about it carefully, so this turns out to take a lot of time, but to be constantly updating it based on what's going on in the market so they stay competitive. And we want to contrast that with sort of other forms of partnerships, so things like internships, career fairs, field trips, festivals, and practica, which are sort of these traditional Soviet-era institutions where you send students to a firm and they work there, in theory. In practice, though, it's not clear what the students do. So I always like to give this example. I had a Portuguese language student when I was a graduate student. I taught Portuguese in Moscow. And she was telling me that she was getting an architecture degree and she went to do practica. And at the time we were just starting this project, I was like, oh, good, what were you doing on your practica? She was like, we were painting walls. That is how she was learning how to do architecture, right? So some of these practica are like real educational experiences. Some aren't. If anybody's interested, maybe you'll be interested, we can talk about later, but we have a hard time distinguishing that, so we sort of lump it into a sort of less costly category. Now, this is to give you a sense of those practices, and I apologize, I did not change the slide, and it loaded the Russian language one. So this is to give you a sense of how, of these different forms I just named, how many regions do them. So this top one here is practica, so you can see it's in most regions, greater than 70. Then we have qualification exams, participation in standards, guaranteed workplaces, investments, yes, so this is capital investments, this is equipment donations, and then student stipends and paying students. So you see that the most popular are things that require a lot of time, much less popular are things that actually require a lot of money. And when you look across sort of the presence of these across partner firms, these are shares of firms that report doing this, right? What you see is that like almost everybody's doing some form of practica, but actually a very small share of firms are doing these other forms. Now, one thing to keep in mind with this data is 2012 is when this program actually started. So we expect to see a lot of this sort of expanding as time goes on, although we don't have data to show that. This is just our sense from sort of the qualitative work we've done. And then here, these box and whisker plots are sort of similar things, but just showing you sort of the mean and sort of medians across regions. So you can see that like all of these are very dispersed, right? So there are regions that are doing a lot and regions that are doing nothing. And this is the same thing, but across schools, right? So you see that there are lots of schools doing very little, right? But in many places, schools that are doing quite a bit. Now, in order to figure out like why that variation, particularly at the regional level, we do a lot. If anybody really wants everything I'm about to tell you on the next 2 slides, I can show you regressions, I can show you the specifications. I'm not going to do that in the interest of time. I'm just going to sort of give you the Cliff's Notes. So one of the things that we do is we take that data that I just showed you and we run a lot of quantitative tests, right? So we look particularly at sort of cross-sectional work using that school data. And specifically we test whether the administrative capacity of the regions, the electoral accountability of the regions, the extent to which United Russia wins by, and the extent to which business has a presence in the legislature, which is sort of our proxy for their access to power, their ability to pressure regional governments, whether these things matter. And we look at both regional level data, so regional level aggregates, but as well as sort of firm level data, right? Looking at firms nested within regions. And generally we find support for the administrative capacity story and the legislative access stories. So both in regions that have a stronger administrative capacity, a stronger ability to monitor and enforce agreements, and those where business is present in the legislature, we see these sorts of costly relationships. Keeping in mind that administrative capacity here, like these two are separate, right? So it could be the case that administrative capacity is this credible commitment story we've told. It could also be the case that these are exactly the regions like Tatarstan where they go around and they tell the businesses, hey, we have a thing that you're going to do for us now. Although, as I'll talk about in a bit, we have a lot of evidence that that's not what's going on. But we also do some original surveys. So we did a survey of 690 firms in 12 regions. And we're specifically interested in whether politicians' beliefs about, businesses' beliefs about the extent to which politicians keep their promises, both from the standpoint of the individual business as well as if you sort of aggregate them and make like a trustworthiness index for the region, whether that matters, right? And then I have some work of my own looking at whether firms that have political connections, right? So again, if you think about this as the ability of businesses to access the government, whether those matter. And we find, actually, that both of these things are important. So both firms that tend to have greater trust in the regional authorities, as well as firms that are in regions that overall think that their authorities are more trustworthy, are more likely to participate in these relationships. And also those that tend to either be members of consultative bodies in the regions or to say that they personally know the governor, regional Duma deputies, or the head of education for the municipalities are also more likely to participate in these. Now, the quantitative work gives you like sort of a big picture, but it doesn't tell us about like what the logic is and how it works on the ground. And so we also did a lot of qualitative work, so interviews in 6 regions and case studies of 4 more. And what this tells us is sort of what the state is actually doing. And it's actually very similar to what we theoretically expected, right? So the states, the region here, right, tend to be encouraging the firms and the schools to work together, to bring them together into forums to do this. And they're monitoring both sides and mediating conflicts. So this is very much what we would expect. What we also find that doesn't show up in the quantitative data, but that we found interesting, is that the regions that are most successful at promoting these relationships are those where, for whatever reason, either the governor or the vice governors or sort of high-level officials in the regional executives put a high priority on this and actually go out and lobby the firms, right? Now, we find that the motives vary. So in Kaluga, it's very much about foreign direct investment, so specifically trying to get Volkswagen to come in and open up a plant. In Belgrade, it's sort of more about economic development and what do you do in a region that doesn't have oil or, but does have a large agricultural sector, but wants to do something besides agriculture. And so for them, it's an attempt to create food processing plants and skilled workers for them. And in Nizhny Novgorod, we find that it has to do with government procurement contracts, which, if you know something about Nizhny Novgorod, basically means we're building tanks, guns, planes, and missiles. But also you see some of this in Sverdlovsk. And some of it just literally appears to be impressing the boss. So particularly when we were looking at the regions that were participating in this sort of in the pre-2012 period, a lot of them are sort of pushing this as a PR mechanism, right? So the governor of Kaluga in particular, and trying to make sure that they're, up in front of federal consultative bodies, the Federal Duma, that whenever Putin comes by, he's being shown in schools, or Medvedev as well. And so while this is obviously not the criteria by which governors are judged in Russia, it certainly helps to look like, you have a specialty and you're doing something. And the reason that we tend to find in our interviews as to why, this matters, it's because generally, as you would expect in the Russian bureaucracy, without sort of attention from the top, the sort of mid-level and lower-level bureaucrats who are responsible for all of this just sort of lose interest, lose energy, and just stop working on it, right? And so you need that sort of sustained effort. Okay, so actually, almost made it. So just to conclude quickly, right, Russian technical and vocational education, and specifically these public-private partnerships, are a unique amalgam, right? They take some things from the Soviet period, they borrow some things from the German model, which is considered best practice in this field, but they sort of add a heavier role of the state, right, and a couple of market mechanisms. And generally, where we see regions that are best at this and that are most interested in it, it tends to be those regions with a lot of state administrative capacity, the ones that can monitor and enforce. The places where the regional government is very activist in promoting these sorts of programs. The places where the authorities are believed to keep their promises and are credible, and places where firms make up a huge share of the legislature, right? And so we argue that this has to do with how you build trust between firms and schools. All of these sort of build back into it. Now, there are some remaining questions that we're hoping to address, and certainly will need to if this actually does turn into a book project. Particularly, we're interested in whether our intuition that a lot of the Soviet-era relationships dissolve is in fact true. We think it is, but we need to prove it. Also thinking about the effect of federal officials in the regions. On the one hand, federal officials mean that if this is a priority for the federal government knows what's going on. On the other hand, if the federal officials are the local FSB, they might be in, very much in the mood to take businesses and expropriate them, in which case federal officials would actually have a negative impact. And we want to think about that. And the last thing, and obviously the most important for the uncertain world we find ourselves in, particularly the uncertain Russia, that at least I find myself in, right, is how is all of this adapting to changing political realities? So in some ways, particularly post-2012, with the advent of sanctions, the need for this becomes stronger because you can no longer rely on sort of external solutions to Russia's economic problems. You need to really build sort of an internal capacity, develop internal industries. On the other hand, doing that may or may not get in the way of rent-seeking and corruption, particularly on the part of regional Siloviki, who, again, I just want to keep emphasizing, are very, very much fans of just taking over local businesses, particularly after they retire. Which, by the way, is based on some of my own research. I'm not pushing an agenda with that. And so given the sort of tensions there between sort of what you do to keep some of your constituencies happy and what you need to do to promote economic development and strengthen the military, how do you sort of navigate those trade-offs? And that's something that we're still exploring. The last thing I would say, just because this is a Ponar's talk and we should have some policy implications, again, is that one of the key tricks to this is specifically to figure out how you can get regional governments involved, because they can perform a lot of these functions and play a very strong role when there's no civil society, right? And what's particularly important, we found, is the ability and the willingness of the regional governments to help with flows of information, to monitor and enforce, right? But to do it in a way that's not simply like, here's more paperwork, right? Which is a difficult problem in Russia. And one of the key things that the regions can do to sort of make it easier on themselves is to think about how they fund the schools, funding the schools in ways that make it more likely that they'll seek firm partners, as well as thinking about how promotions work, and specifically rewarding lower level bureaucrats and school officials for actually promoting these things and getting them done. And finally, integrating firms more directly into structures that make decisions, right? So I talked a lot about the ability of firms to gain access to the legislature. That's certainly one way, but even involving them in regional consultative bodies also seems to help a lot. But again, the key here, and obviously the difficult part in Russia, is that this can't just be sort of a Potemkin exercise, right? You need to actually, substantively allow firms these sorts of access. What I would also point out, again, going a little bit beyond the remit of CONARs, is these things are also important for other countries, right? Russia's not the only middle-income country interested in moving up the value chain, and it's not the only one that has these sorts of institutional problems. And so Tom Remington in particular has been looking at this in China and finding a lot of similar dynamics. Although in China it's obviously a bit more complicated because the government can exert a lot more pressure, but still a lot of the same sort of factors that promote public-private partnerships in Russia also seem to be the case in China, which suggests that this can be applied much more broadly. And with that, I will end my talk and open up for questions.
All right, thank you very much.